Thanks very much. Yeah, so final talk of the day, and I guess that's a good opportunity also just to say a big word of thanks once again to the organisers for organising this symposium. Like Simon, this is my first one, and unfortunately I missed the first couple of days because it overlapped with our global meeting, but I've learned so much just from the first few talks I was able to join today. So thank you so much again to the organisers. Right, I wonder if you can indulge me just for a second. Everyone who's heard of the Red List, raise your hand. Right, of course, of course. Why would you not? Hands down, one of the most influential and important tools available to conservationists today. Widely used by governments to help inform their decision-making, by donors to help inform where they direct their resources and their valuable financial resources, by companies, by corporates to help determine where they need to avoid or mitigate some of their damaging measures, by organizations like our own to help us prioritize and make difficult decisions about where we need to put our efforts, but also by many, many people to understand the living world. So all you need to do is go out into the zoo, take a walk around, and it won't be very long before you stumble across some of the zoo signage that contains some of the messaging and some of the stories contained in the Red List. But what's probably less well known about the Red List is the role of ZSL in basically helping its development, and in particular its scientific development, and more recently growing and expanding the Red List and its influence over time. And so with thanks also to my colleagues, I wanted to spend some time today just kind of acknowledging and reflecting on that. But obviously, as this is a Society for the History of Natural History symposium, I thought that it might be useful just to go back a little bit further in time and think about where we've come from. What is the history of the Red List? Now, this is quite a tricky thing. There have been a couple of people who've spent some time digging back through the history to kind of try and figure out where the history of the Red Lists that we know them today really stands. And it's difficult to point to the first kind of proto-Red List, if you like, but these couple of publications probably stand a pretty good place as a starting point. So the first one at the top there is a publication by William Hornady called Our Vanishing Wildlife, published back in 1917. And in many ways, it probably stands as almost like the first national Red List, because it's kind of like a reflection on vanishing and extinct wildlife within the United States. But there were also a couple of publications that appeared in what's today known as the journal Oryx during the 1930s. I've just put up one picture there from a paper by Guy Dolman, which was really looking at trying to highlight a set of species, in this case mammals, that were either already lost or were kind of on the verge of disappearing forever. So we can kind of look back and say that already well over a century ago, there were these kinds of expressions and lists of species that were deemed to be at risk of extinction or being lost appearing. But it really wasn't until the 1940s that things really picked up and we can really point to the first proto-Red Lists, with the publication of these publications by the American Committee for International Wildlife Preservation. So the first one by Glaver Allen, which was published in 1942, the second one by Francis Harper in 1945, again mostly focused on mammals, but really drawing attention to these species that had either already been lost or were desperately on the point of being rare or at risk of extinction. There was a third volume that was published on the world's birds that actually didn't appear until 1958. And in those intervening years, a couple of key things happened. So one was that in 1948, the International Union for the Preservation of Nature, or what's today known as IUCN, was founded. And then a couple of years later, under the leadership of Hal Coolidge, who actually wrote the foreword to these books, IUCN set up what was called the Survival Service. That was kind of the predecessor to what today is known as the Species Survival Commission. And that had a mandate to document species that were known to be at risk of extinction. And yet throughout much of the 1950s, there actually was very little progress made. And it was only really until the 1960s that that changed, and particularly in 1964 with the publication of these two papers. So these were two lists. So if you like, the first formal lists produced by IUCN, again, one for mammals and one for birds, that were distributed widely to all of the members of IUCN and actually listed a number of species for which there was dire concern, or there was concern about their dire risk of extinction. And it's actually interesting to note, because when you look at this, you can't see it because the font is quite small, but even back then, there was acknowledgement that these lists were incomplete and that they may not fully represent the state of nature. Now, none of these referenced red, right? None of them made any reference to red. So where did that come from? Well, that owes its origin in Sir Peter Scott, who, of course, is most famous here in the UK for the Wildland and Wetlands Trust, but also for drawing the logo of one of the most famous conservation organizations in the world. He was also the chair of the Species Survival Commission at the time, and he proposed the use of the terminology red to kind of signify danger. And in 1966, that kind of got formulated in this, which was the first true red data book. Now, it's actually not technically a book. I mean, it's called book, but actually, it's more of a file. And what it was a loose collection of data sheets, right? So these data sheets had been updated from these earlier ones by Harper and Francis. And the idea was simply that these data sheets would be updated over time. So they would, as they would be updated, they'd be sent out, and then the people who held these files would rip out the one sheet, throw it away, and they'd stick a new data sheet in, and that's how it would be updated, which is quite interesting in a way. It's kind of like a proto-red list website of today. And for many years, that's how red lists were produced. So with a kind loan from the ZSL library, I have a copy here for you to have a look at. You can't go walking off with it, though, because I'll get in trouble. But I do encourage you to go to the ZSL library, because they've got several of them. Now, like I say, none of these were books. These file formats were produced right the way up until the late 1970s. And then in 1978, the first actual red data book appears. And one of the reasons it appeared is that people started getting tremendously confused with these data sheets. It wasn't clear which were the most recent ones. It wasn't clear whether everybody had the most recent sheets. And in fact, today, it's still not even clear whether anyone, anywhere, has a full copy edition of the original data sheets that were ever produced. So from 1978 onwards, we had these data books appear, and it's quite interesting actually that one of the first ones to appear was plants, right? For those of us who've spent a lot of time in the red listing world, there's often this assertion that plants were left behind and so on, but actually they were the first ones to get a book treatment. And then these books appeared over the course of a number of years. We even had a mammal one appearing in 1982. You can see probably that it says Part 1, which gives you an indication of just how much information had been accrued by that time. But by the mid-1980s, there were well over 150 of these red data books in existence. And that led IUCN to kind of take stock and assess, because there was increasing awareness that these lists were getting more and more used, but different terms were being bandied about: rare, indeterminate, threatened, endangered. There was a lot of confusion around it. There was a lot of inconsistency. And with the uptake at a national level, there was a big amount of awareness that there needed to be something done to try and facilitate some commonality. And so in 1984, IUCN ran a symposium that was done in Morges in Switzerland to bring together a set of individuals to take a more holistic look at what needed to be done. And that led to this output on the bottom right in 1987 called The Road to Extinction, edited by Richard Fitter, who I just learned today, whose papers are at the Linnean Society. And on the back of that, that led to this lady entering the scene. This is the late, great Professor Dame Georgina Mace. And she is, in many ways and respects, the godmother of the red list as we know today. Back in 1987-88, Georgina was a research fellow, at ZSL. She was actually splitting her time with the then National Zoo Federation, or what's today known as BIAZA, the British and Irish Association of Zoos. And IUCN approached her to take the lead on developing a system for essentially coming up with a rigorous, quantitative, and objective way for assessing the risk of extinction of species to the wild. And so that's what Georgina did, and she worked together with an American colleague, a gentleman by the name of Russ Landy, and they published this paper in 1991 in the journal Conservation Biology, which by all accounts is easily one of the most seminal papers in all of conservation biology, because in this paper they introduced a draft set of categories and criteria, essentially a system for assessing the risk of extinction of species in the wild. There were then several iterations and revisions that took place working together with IUCN, and finally in 1994, IUCN adopted a version of the red list categories and criteria for wider adoption and use. And then that's what took place over the mid to the late 1990s, starting with all the world's birds. This was something done by BirdLife International. They took on the responsibility for essentially doing red list assessments for what were then probably 8,000 species of birds. But there was also a major effort by Jonathan Baillie, who later would become the Director of Conservation here at ZSL, and Brian Groombridge to do all the world's vertebrates. There was an attempt to do all plants, which I now know Elaine, in her time at IUCN, basically was responsible for shepherding the curation of, and all the world's threatened trees. So there was a significant amount of work that was done to advance the uptake and the use of these categories and criteria. But even still, there was recognition that the criteria and the categories were not perfect. And so one of the things that happened over the coming years was that there was further revision and updates of the criteria. And in 1996, ZSL hosted a workshop among a series of marine biologists, because one of the critiques that had come out was that the red list categories and criteria did not adequately account for commercially exploited species like marine fishes. So ZSL, again, under the leadership of Georgina, convened these scientists at ZSL. That led to a number of draft revisions to the categories and criteria, and also a number of draft assessments for a whole suite of marine fishes, around 150 at the time, that later led to the adoption and the update of a revised system of categories in 2001. But I want to reflect on this because for much of its history, ZSL has been quite instrumental in pioneering the science, the rigor behind the IUCN red list. And that's not just the categories and the criteria themselves, the revisions, to account for these marine concerns, but actually over time. So that graph at the top right sort of shows from 2004 a list of peer-reviewed publications that either derive from red list data or have to do with advances in the red list itself that ZSL staff have been responsible for producing. And just to give you one example, this is a paper that was published in 2023. This paper by Axel Hochkirch and all was an effort to really try and understand how to reduce the number of species assessed as data deficient. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why species get assessed as data deficient, but it's been a topic of great discussion. Are there novel approaches, techniques, and methods that we can use to kind of reduce the proportion of species that are listed as such? Because species that are listed as data deficient may not be threatened, but they may also warrant conservation attention. And while they're sitting in that data deficient bucket, they often are sitting without the needed conservation attention. So over a long period of time, ZSL has played an absolutely pivotal role in kind of furthering and advancing our scientific understanding and the integrity of the red list. Now at this point it's probably appropriate for me to touch on this young man, or young as he was. So this is a gentleman by the name of Ben Collin. I first met Ben back in 2004, actually at a red list assessment workshop, which we were holding on the other side of the zoo to assess the status of all African small mammals. Ben was a PhD student at the time, and he came along to help us facilitate this workshop. And over the coming years, he would become a very influential person, picking up a lot of the reins from Georgina in leading a lot of ZSL's science on the red list. And I'll touch on some of that in a minute. But sadly, in very early 2018, at the age of 40, he passed away from cancer, really picked away in the prime of his life. He was an absolute superstar, and like Georgina, who we also lost a couple of years ago, these were the kind of people who were absolutely influential in helping grow and direct and influence the path of the red list here at ZSL. Now, one of Ben's key things was helping grow a focus on invertebrates. So the red list has often been very focused on vertebrates, the furry and the feathery. And Ben was one of those who saw very early on the opportunity to expand attention on the invertebrates. And so he led a whole suite of efforts together with various colleagues to undertake red list assessments for various invertebrate taxonomic groups, which are the ones kind of highlighted on the right-hand side. And basically, obviously, the colors in yellow, orange, and red correspond to species that are vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, or what we call threatened. Species that are listed in green, those are species that are least concerned. And so you can see the kind of differing proportions of threat. Hydrothermal vent mollusks as a group being very highly threatened, the cephalopods, marine, less so, and then species like freshwater crayfish and some of the selected butterfly groups that we've done kind of in the middle. But collectively, we estimate that as a result of the efforts that ZSL has done, probably around 1/4 of all the invertebrate species that are currently on the red list have something to do with with ZSL, which is a pretty phenomenal achievement. And on the left-hand side is a publication Ben actually co-authored back in 2013, highlighting the status of the world's invertebrates, and actually it'd be really fascinating to revise that now, some 13 years on. One of Ben's other kind of pioneering things was focusing on national red listing, because there was a huge amount of recognition that global red list is important, but actually much decision-making is taken at a national level. And so therefore, we should be trying to support national red listing for two reasons. One is that species that are threatened at a national level, that's often important for helping direct how we inform conservation actions at that scale. And secondly, more than 50% of species are actually endemic to single countries. So if we can advance significant work at a national level, we can feed that through to the global red list. So ZSL over time has played important roles here again. We conducted a national audit of countries that had done national red list assessments back in 2010 and several times since. We've developed a national database for serving up national red list information to the world at large, just like there's a global red list website for serving up global data. And we've delivered a large number of training and webinars and support to countries around the world who have been spearheading these national red listing efforts. By the most recent count, there are probably more than 200 countries that have delivered national red list assessments, and while I'm definitely not suggesting ZSL has been involved in all of those, there's absolutely no doubt that the role of the society in helping influence that has been substantial. The last major scientific development was the Red List Index. So for a long period of time, there was recognition that there was no obvious way of understanding how species risk of extinction was changing over time. And so actually at a meeting in that room, right there behind us in the Bartlett, way back in 2003, a group of very clever people, including Georgina and Ben, got together and worked through a methodology for how we could track change in extinction risk over time. And that led to the development of the Red List Index. It basically aggregates and just genuine changes, so species can change for non-genuine reasons because of new information and mistakes and knowledge and all that sort of thing, but they also change for genuine reasons because of new threats or the mitigation of those threats. So the Red List Index aggregates those changes over time, and then it produces an index whereby the closer you are to 1 on this graph, all your species are least concern, and the closer you get to 0, all your species are extinct. And so in that top left figure, the line tells you two things. Basically, the slope tells you how quickly you're heading towards extinction or how quickly all your species are heading to extinction, while the position of the line on the graph tells you just how threatened you are. So in the bottom right, for example, you can see that countries like Africa, the proportion of species threatened in Africa is much higher than, say, for example, in Europe and Central Asia. And one of the things that Ben did was he developed an approach for a sampled approach, because many of the groups that we might want to understand the trends of over time are just too specious. We're never going to assess them all. So he developed, together with colleagues, an approach for sampling among them to basically develop a sampled index. The last thing I want to touch on is EDGE, and I think that's been referenced a few times, but I wanted to just highlight it because one of the most important things about the red list is the way that it gets used to influence conservation decision making. And hands down, one of the most influential of all things has been the development of the EDGE approach. And basically what EDGE does is brings together two different sources of information: extinction risk and information on evolutionary relationships, and basically combines those to help us identify what are the irreplaceable branches of the tree of life that stand to be lost without conservation actions. So in this example, we can see that turtles as a group are very evolutionarily distinct, but also highly threatened. So there's something that needs to be done in terms of prioritizing our conservation action for those species. But there's no point developing a whole bunch of clever metrics and thinking about fancy ways to prioritize species unless we do something about it. And that's exactly what we did by developing a program that was specifically built to help support early career developing country conservationists take conservation action for those species. And since the program was established in 2007, we've trained around 160 of these folks. Many of them have gone on to become absolute champions and leaders in their fields across the world, setting up new NGOs, discovering new species, winning Whitley Awards, and more. And I think this speaks to the impact of what the Red List can do, but also of what ZSL has achieved. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you.